The smell of smoke hit Caleb Harrow 3 miles before he saw the source, carried on a cold October wind that swept down from the Rockies like a warning no man with good sense would ignore. He pulled his roan stallion to a stop on the ridge above the valley, his dark eyes scanning the tree line below with the practiced patience of a man who had spent 15 years learning to read the land the way other men read scripture. The horse, a broad-chested animal named Scout, shifted beneath him and tossed his head, nostrils wide and trembling. Animals always knew before men did. That was something Caleb's father had told him when he was young, and it had saved his life more times than he cared to count. The valley floor stretched out below in long amber sweeps of autumn grass, the aspens along the creek already gone gold, their leaves shaking in the wind like coins tossed by a careless hand. And there, half hidden where the trail bent sharply around a cluster of ponderosa pines, was what remained of a covered wagon. The canvas top had burned away entirely, leaving only the blackened wooden ribs arching up like the skeleton of some dead creature. The wagon bed itself was a ruin of charred boards, the iron wheel rims sitting in mounds of gray ash. One wheel had collapsed entirely. The whole thing sagged to the left like a man too tired to stand upright any longer. Caleb nudged Scout forward, moving down the ridge at a careful pace, his hand resting easy near the rifle seated in its scabbard. He was not a man who assumed the worst without evidence, but he was not a man who assumed the best without it either. Years in the mountains above the Colorado Territory had burned that kind of recklessness out of him. Out here, the land was honest about what it would cost you. He drew closer, and the details began to fill themselves in. The wagon had not burned recently. The ash had compacted, and the edges had gone gray with age, which told him this had happened perhaps 2-3 days ago at the outside. The iron cooking ring near the front wheel had tipped over and lay half buried in soot. A tin coffee pot, miraculously intact, sat propped against a wheel, spoke as though someone had set it there deliberately. A woman's shawl, dark blue wool, lay folded on what remained of the wagon's front seat board, and that detail, more than anything else, stopped the breath in Caleb's chest. Someone was still here. He dismounted quietly, looping Scout's reins around a pine branch, and moved forward on foot. The ash crunched under his boots. He scanned the perimeter without making it obvious he was scanning, a habit so old it had become instinct. Then he saw her. She was tucked beneath the burned-out wagon bed, curled on her side in the small protected space between the axle and the ground, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled of smoke so badly he could smell it from 10 feet away. Her hair was dark and loose, spread across the ground beneath her head, tangled with ash and pine needles. She was asleep, or something close to it. Her breathing was shallow, and her lips had gone the color of creek ice. Caleb crouched down and studied her for a long moment. She was young, 20 or so, he guessed, with a fine-boned face smudged with soot, dark lashes fanned against pale cheeks. She wore a calico dress that had seen better days, and a pair of leather boots that were far too thin for October in Colorado. Her hands, folded near her face, were red and chapped, the knuckles raw. He had not spoken to a woman in 4 months. The last time had been in Durango when he had traded a winter's worth of pelts for supplies and exchanged 3 sentences with the woman who ran the dry goods counter. He was not what anyone would have called accustomed to the company of people, let alone a young woman sleeping in the ruins of a burned wagon in the middle of a Colorado valley on the edge of the first hard freeze of the year. He leaned closer. "Miss," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended from disuse. "Miss, you need to wake up." She did not move. He reached out and touched her shoulder, gentle but firm, and felt the cold through the blanket like a stone held under water. That was alarming. She was too cold. The temperature had dropped significantly after sunset the night before, and it would drop again tonight to something far worse. "Miss," he shook her shoulder carefully. "Miss, I need you to wake up right now." She stirred. Her eyes opened, and they were the kind of brown that catches amber light and turns it into something remarkable, though Caleb did not have time to notice that. What he noticed was that she looked at him with the flat, unfocused expression of someone who had passed well beyond exhaustion into something on the other side of it, and that she did not immediately pull away from his hand on her shoulder, which told him she was too far gone to be properly frightened. "There is someone," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "I thought I heard someone." "My name is Caleb Harrow," he said. "I'm going to help you. Can you tell me your name?" She blinked slowly. The focus was coming back into her eyes, and with it came caution, that old animal wariness that any sensible creature develops when they have been hurt badly enough. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Marsh. Miss Marsh. Are you hurt? Beyond the cold, I mean. Are you injured anywhere?" She considered this with the careful slowness of someone taking inventory. "My wrist," she said. "I fell when it—" She stopped. Something moved across her face that was not pain exactly, but something heavier than that. "Can you stand?" "I do not know." "Let us find out," he said. "I'm going to help you up. Take your time." He got her out from under the wagon with the careful handling you would give a person made of something fragile, his hands under her arms and then supporting her as she got her legs beneath her. She was small but not frail, and once she was standing, she had more steadiness in her than he had expected. She swayed once, grabbed the charred wagon frame for balance, immediately pulled her hand back from the soot, and then straightened herself by sheer force of will. She looked at him then, really looked at him, fully upright and trying to make sense of what she was seeing, which Caleb understood. He was not a man who was easy to make sense of at first. He stood 6 feet and 3 inches tall, broad through the shoulders and thick through the chest, in a way that came not from any deliberate effort, but simply from 15 years of hard mountain living. His arms were built for carrying, his hands for gripping, and the whole of him was wrapped in a sheepskin coat that added to the impression of considerable size. His dark hair had grown long over the summer, touching his collar, and he had a beard that he trimmed when he thought of it, which was not often. He had been told, on the few occasions he had been in close proximity to town women, that he could be intimidating to look at. Eleanor Marsh, however, looked at him with an expression that suggested she was conducting a rapid and pragmatic calculation rather than experiencing fear. Her brown eyes moved from his face to his hands, to the rifle scabbard visible over his shoulder, and then back to his face. "You are a trapper," she said. "Mountain man," he said, which he always felt was more accurate. "I run trap lines in the winter, and I guide hunting parties in the summer. I have a cabin up on the East Ridge about 4 miles from here." "How did you find me?" "Smelled the smoke. The wind carries it a long way down this valley." He paused. "Miss Marsh, we need to get you warm before we have any other kind of conversation. Can you ride?" She looked at Scout, who had turned his large head to observe the proceedings with calm brown eyes. "I can ride," she said. "Your wrist," he said. "Which one?" She lifted her left hand. The wrist was swollen, the skin discolored in a way that suggested it was either badly sprained or cracked through. He examined it with careful fingers, and she held very still and only drew in one short breath when he pressed along the bone. "Nothing displaced," he said. "Likely a bad sprain. Maybe a small fracture. Either way, it needs binding and rest." "I have been managing." "For how long?" She was quiet for a moment. 3 days, she said. "It has been 3 days since the fire. 3 days alone in a burned wagon in October in the Colorado foothills with a damaged wrist and no shelter." Caleb absorbed this information and then set it aside. He would want the full story, but first things first. "Can you tell me quickly before we move whether you are alone? Is there anyone I need to be looking for?" The thing that moved across her face this time was unmistakably grief, sudden and then quickly pressed down by the same will that had kept her standing. "I am alone," she said. "My husband was taking us west. He died of fever 2 weeks ago in Pueblo. I kept going because I did not know what else to do. The fire started from a cook fire in the night. I got out." She stopped. "I got out, but everything burned." Caleb looked at her. 21, maybe 22 years old, widowed, lost everything, 3 days in an October valley with a bad wrist and no fire. He had seen harder things in 15 years in the mountains, but not many. "All right," he said. "We are going to go to my cabin. You will have a warm fire and food and a proper roof, and then tomorrow we will figure out the rest of it together. Does that suit you?" She looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in her expression that was trying to decide whether trust was a luxury she could afford or a necessity she could not refuse. "It suits me," she said. He got her onto Scout with his hands under her boot, lifting her up with an ease that she noticed, though she did not say anything. He took the reins and led the horse on foot up the ridge trail. Eleanor Marsh sat in the saddle wrapped in the smoky horse blanket and held herself straight, which he also noticed. The trail to his cabin wound up through aspen groves and then into the lower pine belt, following a creek for a mile before cutting east across an open slope where the wind came hard off the high peaks. Caleb watched the sky and knew they had perhaps 2 hours of light left. The clouds building over the Continental Divide were the pewter gray of serious weather. Not a threat yet, but a promise. "How long have you lived up here?" Eleanor asked. She had been quiet for most of the climb, and her voice, when it came, had more strength in it than he had expected, the warmth of movement beginning to work on her. "Since I was 23, he said. "My father was a trapper, and he taught me the trade. I was born in Pennsylvania, but this became home." "How old are you now?" 34. She did not respond to that directly, but he heard something that might have been her processing it. "Where were you and your husband trying to get to?" he asked, because it seemed reasonable to keep her talking and her mind working. "Oregon," she said. "My husband Thomas had a cousin there who had land. We thought—" She paused. "We thought it was going to be the beginning of something. It is very late in the season to be on the Oregon Trail." "I know that now," she said, and there was a dry note in her voice that surprised him. It was not bitterness exactly. It was the sound of a woman who had been through something terrible and had come out the other side with her sense of irony intact, which in Caleb's experience was a sign of genuine character. He liked that, though he did not say so. The cabin came into view as the trail crested a small rise above the creek, and he heard her exhale. He supposed it was a relief after 3 days in the ruins of a wagon. It was not a fine house. He had built it himself over the course of 2 summers, adding to what had originally been a trapper's dugout left by some earlier occupant of these mountains whose name nobody knew. The main room was solid log construction, with a proper stone fireplace, a plank floor, and a roof made from split pine shingles that had been good enough to keep 4 winters off his head. There was a small lean-to addition on the back where he stored supplies, and a separate shed for Scout and the pack mule he called Nothing, because the animal refused to be named. He helped Eleanor down from the saddle and left her standing by the hitching post while he put Scout in the shed with a measure of oats and then came back to open the cabin door. The interior was cold and dark, but it smelled of pine and leather and wood smoke, and there was a quality of solidity about it that was unmistakably a home, even a rough one. He had a fire built and blazing within 10 minutes. He had done it so many times that it was less a process than an automatic series of movements, kindling from the dry box, split pine on top, the striker he kept by the mantel producing a spark on the second stroke. The fire caught with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting. Eleanor lowered herself onto the bench by the table and held her good hand toward the heat. In the firelight, he could see the damage that 3 days of cold and stress had done to her more clearly. There were shadows beneath her eyes that went beyond tiredness into something structural. Her lips were cracked. The soot on her face, which he had noticed outside, was more extensive than he had realized, and her hair, dark brown and wavy, was a ruin of knots and ash. "I'm going to make you something to eat and drink," he said, "and I'm going to bind your wrist. Those are the priorities. After that, you can sleep." "You are very organized about this," she said. "I try to be useful." "Most men who found a woman in my situation would have a great deal more to say about it," she said. She was not accusing. She was observing, and the observation had a careful quality to it, as though she were testing the edges of something. "Most men are not trying to get supper started before the cold sets in," he said, and he meant it lightly. But she smiled, and the smile changed her face in a way that he felt as a specific physical thing in his chest, which surprised him enough that he turned quickly toward the supply shelf. He had venison jerky and dried beans and cornmeal, and a good supply of tinned goods from his last trip to Durango. He made her a mug of strong tea first, sweetened with the last of his honey supply, and set it in front of her without ceremony. She wrapped both hands around it and drank slowly, and some of the structural cold began to leave her face. He bound her wrist with a strip of clean linen cut from his spare shirt, tight enough to support but not enough to restrict, explaining what he was doing as he did it because he thought it was proper to narrate a thing like that, rather than simply handle a woman's arm without her full awareness of his intentions. She held her wrist steady through the whole process and watched his hands with the same careful attention she had given everything else. "You know about injuries," she said. "I have had to know," he said. "Out here there is no doctor you can send for." "What do you do when it is something serious?" "You do what you can, and you pray the rest works out." He tied the last knot. "I have been lucky, or careful. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference." He made cornmeal porridge for their supper because it was fast and easy and filling, and he added dried venison to it and a little salt. It was not refined cooking, and he did not pretend it was. He set the bowl in front of her and sat across the table with his own. She ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had not had a proper meal in 3 days, which she had not, and she did not slow down or become self-conscious about it, which he respected. There was no pretense to Eleanor Marsh. She was hungry and she ate, and she was tired and she said so when she had finished. "I can sleep anywhere," she said. "If you have a blanket, I can roll up near the fire." "There is a pallet in the corner," he said. "I sleep at the foot of the fireplace. You can have the pallet. It is more comfortable than it looks." "Where will you sleep?" "I told you," he said, "by the fire. I have slept in worse places." She looked at him across the table, and that calculation was in her eyes again, but something else too. Something that was simpler and more honest than calculation. "Thank you," she said. "I do not think I would have lasted another night." He did not say anything to that because there was nothing useful to add to it. He simply nodded and began clearing the supper things. She was asleep within 20 minutes, buried under the heavy wool blanket he kept folded at the foot of the pallet, and Caleb sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the wind come up outside and thinking about the year the winter had come in October, and how the aspens had been stripped bare in 2 days by a cold that killed 3 cattle in the lower valley. He thought about Eleanor Marsh saying, "We thought it was going to be the beginning of something." He thought about what it cost a person to keep going forward when the thing you were going toward no longer existed. He did not let himself think about the smile, though it was there at the edges. The storm arrived the next morning while the sky was still gray. Caleb was up before light as always, had the fire built back up and water heating before he heard Eleanor stir. She came awake with the alert suddenness of someone who had been sleeping with one ear open for a long time, sitting up on the pallet with the blanket around her shoulders and her dark hair loose around her face, and for just a moment she looked at the cabin walls with an expression of pure, disoriented confusion, as though she had forgotten where she was. Then she looked at him and remembered. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the particular roughness of deep sleep. "Good morning," he said. "There's a storm coming in off the peaks. We will be inside today." She looked toward the small window, through which the sky was visible as a sheet of flat lead. "How bad?" "Could be 2 days, could be 4. This time of year it is difficult to predict." He handed her a mug of coffee, strong and black, and she took it without asking for anything to be added to it, which he noted. "I need to tell you something," she said, both hands around the mug, looking at him with the directness that he was beginning to understand was simply part of how she was made. "I have no money. Everything I had was in that wagon. Whatever I owe you for the shelter and the food, I do not have a way to pay it right now. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a loan of sorts, because I intend to find some way to work when I get to wherever I am going next, and I will repay you." He looked at her. The speech had cost her something. He could see that. It was the speech of a proud person forcing themselves to say a necessary thing. "Miss Marsh," he said, "I do not run a boarding house, and I am not extending you credit. You were dying in a burned wagon. I brought you here. That is the end of the calculation as far as I am concerned." She opened her mouth. "You can help with the cabin chores if it makes you feel better about the arrangement," he added, before she could object. "I am not in the habit of refusing useful help." She closed her mouth. A beat passed. "All right," she said. "What needs doing?" That was how it began, the working together. She could not do the heavier outdoor work with the wrist the way it was, but there was plenty she could do inside. She reorganized his supply shelf, which had accumulated the chaos of someone who knew where everything was and therefore had never bothered to impose order on it. And she told him plainly what she was doing and why before she did it, so that he would not come looking for the cornmeal and find it had moved. He appreciated that. He had lived alone for a long time, and he did not like surprises in his own home. She mended the hole in his spare blanket that had been letting cold in for 2 winters and had never risen to the level of urgency required to actually attend to it. She used a bone needle and heavy thread from the sewing kit that had been his mother's, one of the few things he had carried with him when he left Pennsylvania, and she worked with the quick, steady precision of someone who had mended things all her life. While the storm rattled the shutters and pushed snow against the north wall of the cabin, they talked. He learned that she was 22 years old, born in Ohio to a family that had farmed corn for 3 generations, that she had married Thomas Marsh when she was 20 because he was decent and had seemed determined, and that she had loved him in the way you love someone whose company is reliable and whose intentions are good, which is a real and honest love, even if it is not the kind of love that fills you up until you cannot contain it. She said this without self-pity and without disloyalty, simply as fact, which he respected. She learned that he had come west at 23 after a winter of deep dissatisfaction with the life Pennsylvania offered him, which was to say a job in a tannery and a small house, and a life that fit him the way a coat 2 sizes too small fits a man. He had come west because his father's stories of the mountains had never left him, and he had found the mountains, and they had turned out to be everything the stories had promised, and more. "Do you not get lonely?" she asked on the second day of the storm, when they were sitting across from each other at the table, and the wind outside had risen to the pitch that meant real cold. He considered the question seriously, as he tried to do with all serious questions. "In the summer, not much," he said. "The mountains are full of things in the summer, in February sometimes. But you stay." "I stay," he agreed. "Why?" He thought about it. "Because everything out here is honest," he said. "The cold is honest. The storms are honest. The elk and the bear and the mountain lion, they are honest about what they are. The land does not pretend to be something easier than it is." He paused. "I have found that I do not do well with pretending." She looked at him in the firelight. "Neither do I," she said. She had a way of looking at him that was entirely level, without coyness or evasion, but also without aggression. She simply looked at a thing directly, and it made him feel that she was seeing whatever was actually there to be seen, which was not a feeling he was accustomed to, and which did something strange and specific to the rhythm of his breathing. On the 3rd morning of the storm, she asked to see the view from the rise behind the cabin when the wind died down enough to allow a brief walk. He thought she needed to move, to be outside after 3 days of close quarters, and so he wrapped her in his heavy coat over her own inadequate one, and they walked out through 8 inches of new snow to the rise where the pines thinned and the full length of the valley was visible below. She stood beside him and looked out over the white sweep of it, the creek a dark line through the snow, the aspens stripped to silver skeletons, the high peaks behind them rose-colored in the morning light, and she was quiet for a long time. "It is beautiful," she said. Her breath made a small cloud in the cold air. "Yes," he said. "I have been in Colorado for 6 weeks, and I do not think I ever actually stopped to look at it until now." She paused. Thomas was always looking at the road ahead, not in a bad way. He was just always aimed at the next thing. "And you?" She glanced sideways at him. "I look at things," she said. "I always have. It used to drive my mother half wild. She would send me to fetch water, and I would come back an hour later because I had stopped to look at a hawk on a fence post." He smiled, which he was aware of because smiling was not a common event for him. "A hawk on a fence post is worth looking at," he said. She turned to look at him full on, standing in the snow in his oversized coat with her dark hair loose over the collar, and her expression was something he could not quite name, something warm and searching and a little wondering. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I am not sure," she said honestly, "but not this." He knew what she meant, though he could not have put it into words either. He was aware that there was something between them in that cold mountain morning that had not been between them 4 days ago, something that had been building in the close warmth of the cabin and the shared meals and the long conversations, and that had now stepped out into the open along with them. He was also aware that it was too soon to say anything about it, that she was grieving a husband and had nothing to her name, and was standing in a borrowed coat on the top of a mountain, and that a man who took advantage of those circumstances did not deserve to be thought well of. He turned back toward the cabin. "We should go back in before the cold gets into your wrist," he said, and she followed without argument. But she was smiling when she came through the door, and he saw it, and he held the warmth of it the way a man holds an ember when the fire has gone low. The storm broke fully on the fourth day, and the world outside was transformed into something clean and brilliant and entirely new. The snow had laid itself over everything in smooth curves, the trees heavy and still, the sky above them, the hard, deep blue that only comes after a mountain storm, has scoured the air down to its bones. Caleb spent the morning clearing snow from around the shed and checking on Scout and Nothing, who were in fine spirits and eager to be out. Eleanor stood in the cabin doorway while he worked, watching, and after a while she came out and with her good hand she began scooping snow away from the chopping block without being asked, using a piece of flat wood she had found leaning against the cabin wall as an improvised shovel. He noticed the easy, natural way she worked, the efficiency of her movement. She did not overexert the wrist. She thought about the physical problem in front of her and solved it sensibly. He liked watching her think, he was realizing, which was a discovery that sat in his chest like a warm coal. Over the days that followed, as the snow settled and the temperature climbed back to a livable range, they established a rhythm. He spent the mornings checking his trap lines, the routes he ran in the lower valley that he would soon begin expanding toward the upper slopes for the winter. She kept the cabin, cooked the noon meal, worked on the mounting pile of small repairs that accumulated in any dwelling where a man lives alone and does not bother with aesthetics. His spare snowshoes needed new rawhide lacing. She asked him to show her how it was done, and then did it herself, working the rawhide with patient focus through an entire afternoon while he cured a set of pelts at the other end of the table. They did not talk all the time. There were stretches of comfortable quiet that were, he thought, among the best things he had known. He had lived alone long enough to know that silence with another person is either a strain or a gift, and silence with Eleanor was the second kind. In the evenings, he read to her from the small shelf of books he kept, which had become a somewhat eccentric collection over the years. A natural history of the Rocky Mountain region, 2 volumes of Shakespeare, a well-worn Bible, and a complete collection of the works of Washington Irving that he had acquired from a book dealer in Denver. She preferred Irving, which he took as evidence of good sense. She had a habit of arguing with the text, talking back to the book as he read, which made him laugh more than he had laughed in a long time. Her wrist improved daily. By the 10th day, it was well enough to allow light use, and she declared this loudly and with some satisfaction, flexing it experimentally and pronouncing it serviceable. On the 12th day, she went quiet over the supper dishes, not the comfortable quiet, the other kind. He waited. "I need to think about what I'm going to do," she said. "I cannot stay here forever. I should be going somewhere." "Where?" he asked. She put down the dish. "I do not know," she said. "Oregon was Thomas's plan, not mine, truly. I have no one there. I have a sister in Kansas, but she is married with 4 children and a husband who is barely keeping them fed. I could go back to Ohio, but there is nothing there for me either. My parents died years ago. There is just a farm that belongs to a cousin now." She paused. "I'm very skilled at finding myself with nowhere particular to be." He sat back in his chair and looked at the fire for a moment, and then he looked at her. "You could stay here," he said. "Through the winter at minimum. The passes will be dangerous for another month at least, and Durango is 2 days' ride in decent conditions. Going alone in November is not sensible." "I cannot simply live in your cabin indefinitely," she said. "Why not?" he said, and it came out more direct than he had intended, without the qualifying tone that might have made it easier to dismiss. She looked at him. He held her gaze. The fire cracked. "Caleb," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt it with physical specificity, like a hand laid between his shoulder blades. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," he said. I'm saying that it is a hard winter, and you have no resources, and I have a cabin, and it would be foolish of both of us to pretend that the sensible thing and the thing I want to happen are not, in this case, the same thing." A long silence. Her brown eyes were very steady on his face. "The thing you want to happen," she said carefully. "You are good company," he said. "Better company than I have had in a long time. Better than I expected to have again, if I'm being honest." He looked at the fire again, which was easier. "I know you are widowed, and that you have been through a great deal, and that this is all very soon, and I am not asking you to feel anything you do not feel. I am only saying that I do not want you to go." The silence that followed was the longest one she had given him. He did not push it. "I do not want to go either," she said finally. "That is the honest answer." He looked at her then, and she was looking back, and between them was something that was past careful and past cautious, something that had been building in 14 days of close quarters, honesty and warm firelight and shared work, and the particular intimacy of two people discovering that they fit together in a way neither of them had fully expected. He did not move toward her. He was not a man who moved without thought, but he let himself feel it, the wanting, the specific and increasing wanting of this particular woman's company, her laugh, her level brown eyes, her way of talking back to books, her deliberate hands on the rawhide lacings. "All right," he said, "then stay." She nodded once, and something settled between them, some decision made and acknowledged, and the evening resumed as though it had not been a turning point, though they both knew it had. There was a supply run he needed to make to Durango before winter locked in completely, a 2-day trip down the mountain with pack animals, restocking on flour and salt and ammunition, and several other things that the cabin would need for the months ahead. He had been putting it off because of the storm, and then because of Eleanor, and now he put it off a few more days because it occurred to him, with a directness that surprised even himself, that he did not want to leave her alone on the mountain just yet. He taught her to fire his spare pistol on the 6th day after the storm, setting up a row of tin cans on the chopping block and standing behind her while she learned the weight and the kick and the patience required. She was not naturally a markswoman, but she was a precise and attentive student, and by the end of the afternoon, she had put 3 out of 5 shots in a can, which was good enough for a beginner and far better than he had managed on his first day with a pistol at the age of 9. "You are a decent teacher," she told him, handing the pistol back handle first. "You are a decent student," he returned. Their hands brushed on the exchange, and they both noticed it, and neither of them mentioned it, but the awareness of it sat in the air between them for the rest of the afternoon. They went to Durango together. He had decided this somewhat abruptly on a Monday morning, coming in from the shed to find her repairing the leather strap on his supply pack without being asked, and looking so entirely at home in the act that something in his chest had simply made a decision. "Come to Durango with me," he said. She looked up from the strap. "All right," she said, with the speed that told him she had been hoping he would ask. The trip down the mountain took the better part of 2 days. They rode Scout and nothing, the mule resigned as always to whatever was being asked of him, and the trail was spectacular with the snow still on the peaks and the lower valleys, brown and gold in the autumn sun. Eleanor rode well, better than he had initially realized, moving with the horse with the ease of someone who had grown up around animals. They talked the whole way down, the way people talk when they have already said the cautious things and have moved into the territory of talking simply because they want to. He told her about the years of learning the mountains, the first winter he had nearly died of cold when a storm caught him above the tree line, and he had dug himself into a snowbank and waited it out for 18 hours, thinking with considerable clarity about every choice he had made in his life. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, summers along the river, the smell of corn in August, a particular tree she had loved to climb, because from the top of it you could see 20 miles on a clear day. "I always thought I would leave Ohio," she said. "I just did not imagine leaving the way I left." "Most things that change your life do not announce themselves ahead of time," he said. She glanced at him sideways, riding beside him on the trail where it widened. "Is that a mountain man's wisdom or just the truth?" "I'm not sure there is a difference," he said, and she laughed, and the sound of it carried out through the pine trees and over the valley in a way that felt important, though he could not have said exactly why. Durango in November of 1878 was a rough-edged settlement in the full thrust of its early growth, with the new railroad spur bringing commerce and people and noise to what had previously been a quiet trading post. The main street was mud and planks, the smell of horses and smoke and fresh timber competing in the air, and the general energy was the tense anticipatory energy of a place still in the process of deciding what it was going to be. Eleanor took it in with wide eyes that softened into something thoughtful as they rode down the main street. He could see her processing it, the saloon fronts and the assay office and the seamstress's shop with its hand-painted sign and the hardware store and the small frame church at the far end, all of it compressed together in the frontier's particular way of putting everything on the same block. He had a particular order to these supply runs, and he went through it methodically, the general store first for the bulk items, then the feed store, then the gunsmith for ammunition. At each stop, he introduced Eleanor simply as Miss Marsh, without additional explanation, and the town received her with the frank curiosity that small communities apply to anyone new, and the particular attention that any woman of reasonable appearance receives in a place where women are outnumbered 4-1. At the general store, the proprietor, a broad-faced man named Hendricks, who had a talent for knowing more about a situation than he appeared to, looked between Caleb and Eleanor with a measuring interest and said only, "Nice to meet you, Miss Marsh. You let me know if there is anything you need particular," which was more tact than Caleb usually got from Hendricks, and which he appreciated. Eleanor, for her part, was practical about the purpose of the trip. She identified 3 items she needed beyond what he was already purchasing: a heavy wool skirt to replace the damaged one she was wearing, a pair of proper winter boots, and a good wool hat. And she told him this directly, and told him equally directly that she would find a way to repay him. And he said the same thing he had said before, which was that the accounting could be left to a later date, and she accepted this with the slight compression of her lips that meant she was accepting a thing she intended to revisit. He bought her the hat and the skirt and the boots, and he also bought her a good heavy coat without telling her he was doing it until Hendricks was already wrapping it, at which point she looked at him with an expression that was simultaneously exasperated and moved. "That was underhanded," she said. "It is going to be a hard winter," he said. "Caleb, you cannot wear the same coat all winter." She looked at him for a long moment in the dim golden light of the general store, and then she looked at the coat, and then she looked back at him, and what was in her face was something past gratitude and closer to the particular and defenseless feeling that comes when someone sees you clearly and acts accordingly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Really quietly, in the way that means more than the louder version. They stayed overnight at the lodging house on the edge of town, 2 separate rooms, and in the morning over breakfast at the dining table the lodging house provided, he told her there was something he needed to attend to before they rode back, a matter of a debt he was owed by a man named Colton, who ran one of the smaller trading posts at the edge of town. He did not think much of this errand. Colton was a man he had done business with for 3 years, a reasonable man with a tendency to let debts accumulate past comfortable, and Caleb expected the whole thing to take 20 minutes. He left Eleanor in the dining room of the lodging house with a second cup of coffee and went to find Colton. He found him, but the debt conversation did not go the way he expected. Colton was in a state of visible agitation, his trading post in partial disarray, and the cause of this was immediately apparent in the form of 2 men leaning against the counter with the particular stillness of men who have made themselves at home where they have no right to be. They were both armed, both carrying the unhealthy look of men who had been living hard and who had developed, through that process, the habit of taking what they needed. One of them, the larger of the 2, looked at Caleb when he came through the door and assessed him with the quick professional attention of a man accustomed to sizing up opposition. "Just here for business?" Caleb said to Colton, keeping his voice easy. "If you are occupied, I can come back." Colton's eyes said, "Come back." Colton's mouth said, "Harrow, no, He stopped. The larger man pushed off the counter. He was not as tall as Caleb, but he had the wiry, coiled energy of someone who had survived on quickness. "Harrow," he said, trying the name. "You are the trapper up on the East Ridge." "Mountain man," Caleb said. "That is a distinction that matters to you." "It does." "I heard there's a woman up at your place," the man said. "Come down here with you as it happens." He had a flat smile that did not reach his eyes. Young widow, I hear. All alone in the world. Caleb was aware of exactly how still he had gone. It was the mountain stillness, the specific, absolute quiet of a man who has found that being very still in certain situations accomplishes more than any amount of movement. You heard incorrectly, he said. Hendricks talks, the man said pleasantly. I do not blame him. It is interesting news, a woman staying up there with a mountain man, woman with no money, no family, nowhere to go. He paused. There are people who help women like that, you know. Find them better situations. The way he said it made the situation clear. These were not good men. They were the kind of men who circled vulnerability the way wolves circle a fire, waiting for the light to fail. I'm going to give you some advice, Caleb said. Leave Colton's store and leave Durango and do not come back, and in exchange for that I will not make the next 5 minutes something you will be carrying around with you for a long time. The man's smile sharpened. Big talk for one man? I am not talking, Caleb said. I am informing. What happened in the next 3 minutes was not something Caleb was proud of, exactly, but it was something he was thorough about. The larger man reached first, which was a mistake, and discovered very quickly that the man across from him was not a man whose size was decorative. Caleb Harrow had spent 15 years doing work that required the full application of real physical strength on a daily basis, chopping wood and hauling game and handling pack animals and climbing slopes that would have buckled most men. He was built for this in the way a tool is built for a specific purpose, and the purpose, when it came to it, was dispatched with the focused efficiency of someone who does not waste effort. Both men ended up outside on the boardwalk, one of them sitting, and the other lying on his back, looking at the November sky with the expression of a man reconsidering his choices. Caleb went back inside, retrieved the $40 Colton owed him, told Colton to send for the sheriff, and went back to the lodging house. Eleanor was still at the table, had acquired a third cup of coffee, and was deep in a conversation with the lodging house proprietress, a wide, warm, practical woman named Mrs. Alderman, who had clearly taken to her in the way that certain women immediately take to other women who are clever and direct. Eleanor looked up when he came in. Her eyes moved over him quickly, taking inventory. You are all right, she said. It was not a question. She had already established this. Fine, he said. What happened? He told her. Not the full account, but enough. He told her about the 2 men and what they had been suggesting about her situation and what he had done about it. He watched her face while he talked. She did not go pale or frightened. She went quiet in the way that meant she was thinking hard and fast. They knew about me, she said. Hendricks talks, he said. I will have a word with him before we leave. Caleb, she set down her coffee. I am not a woman who needs to be wrapped in cotton, she said. I have been through a great deal in the last several weeks, and I am still here, as you have noticed. But I am also not a fool about what I am, which is a woman alone in a place where being a woman alone carries specific risks. I know this. I'm not asking you to pretend it is not so. She paused. What I am saying is thank you, and also that I am sorry you had to. Do not be sorry, he said. I am anyway, she said. A little. They rode back up the mountain that afternoon, the pack animals loaded with supplies, the trail familiar beneath Scout's easy stride. The day was cold and bright, the kind of day that makes the high country look like a painting, and Eleanor rode beside him. And they did not talk much, because there was a particular kind of companionship that does not require words to maintain itself. That evening, unpacking the supplies in the cabin, she found the spare book he had slipped into the pack at the general store without her noticing. It was a volume of poems, Longfellow, with a green cover worn soft by many hands. She held it and looked at him. You are incorrigible, she said. You said you liked Longfellow, he said. I did say that. She held the book, and then she put it gently on the shelf between Irving and Shakespeare. I said it once, a week ago. I listen, he said, and went back to unpacking. He heard her behind him, very quiet, and then he heard her say his name. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the cabin, the firelight on her face and in her hair, and she was looking at him with an expression that had nothing cautious or calculating in it, nothing guarded or held back, just the full honest thing itself, open and certain. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said. "I think it has been happening for a while, and I did not want to say it because of everything, because it is soon, and because of Thomas, and because I know I am in a complicated situation, and I do not want you to think I am saying it because of the situation. I want you to know it is not because of the situation, it is in spite of the situation." She stopped. "I am saying this now because I believe in saying true things directly." He looked at her across the cabin. The fire was behind him and the wind was outside, and the whole world for the moment was this room and this woman standing in it being completely honest with him. He crossed the cabin in 3 strides. He did not think about it. He was done thinking about it. He cupped her face in both hands and she tipped her face up toward him, and he kissed her, slow and certain, the way you do something that you have been thinking about doing for long enough that when you finally do it, you want to be entirely present for every part of it. She kissed him back with exactly the same quality of certainty, her good hand coming up to his chest and pressing flat against it, feeling his heartbeat, which was faster than he would have liked it to be if he were trying to appear composed. When they finally stepped back from each other, she had her eyes closed for a moment, and then she opened them and looked up at him with that level brown gaze. "I am in love with you too," he said, in case that was not apparent. She smiled. The big smile, the one that changed her face into something that went directly past his chest and rearranged things. "It was slightly apparent," she said. He laughed, loud and real, and she laughed with him. And outside, the wind was cold, and the winter was coming in fast off the mountains. But in the cabin, the fire was bright, and something had been said and answered, truly and fully, and without any pretending, which was exactly how he needed it to be. November deepened into December, and with it came the particular hard magnificence of a Colorado winter in the high country. The mornings were brutal, the temperature dropping far enough that the creek ran under ice, and Scout's breath made great clouds in the shed. The days were often brilliant, the snow-covered peaks blazing in the thin high-altitude sun, the air so clear it made your eyes water. The evenings were long and lamplit and warm. They were happy. It was a simple and astonishing thing, and Caleb did not take it for granted for a moment. He was a man who had spent 15 years being self-sufficient, had organized his entire life around not needing anything from another person, had convinced himself that this was preference rather than compensation for the absence of options. Eleanor Marsh had dismantled this argument in approximately 3 weeks and had not even appeared to be trying. She was not easy. She had opinions, and she stated them, and she pushed back when she thought he was wrong, which happened with a regularity that he found invigorating rather than frustrating. She did not manage him or cosset him or defer to him on matters where she had better judgment, which she did sometimes, because she was sharp, and she paid attention, and she had a kind of instinctive practical intelligence that could solve a problem by looking at it from an angle he had not considered. She was also, beneath the directness, genuinely tender. He would come in from the trap lines to find the cabin warm and a meal ready, and she would hand him the coffee without being asked because she had learned his patterns. And when his hip gave him trouble on the cold mornings, the old injury from a fall on an icy slope 5 winters back, she noticed before he said anything, and she did not make a fuss about it, but she would put an extra log on the fire and make the kind of tea that helped, the one with dried willow bark that his mother had used. He thought about his mother sometimes in those weeks. His mother had been a woman of that same quality, a directness paired with a tenderness that was expressed in action rather than words. He had not expected to find another person like that. He had not been looking. He told Eleanor this one evening, which was more than he typically offered in the way of personal revelation, and she listened with the quality of listening she gave things that mattered, entirely present and without interruption. "She sounds wonderful," she said when he had finished. "She was," he said. "She died when I was 17. That was part of why I left Pennsylvania. After she was gone and my father was gone, there was nothing holding me." "I understand that," she said. "The leaving when the thing that held you is gone." "I know you do." She looked at him. "But I'm beginning to think," she said slowly, "that the thing that holds you is not always a place." She paused. Sometimes it is a person. He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his. Yes, he said. It is. Christmas came to the mountain with a fresh snowfall that covered everything in a white so clean it looked painted, and Caleb cut a small pine from the lower slope and brought it in, and Eleanor decorated it with strips of red calico she cut from her damaged old dress and with small carved pine cones she had been working on for 2 weeks without telling him the purpose, and the whole thing was modest and completely beautiful in the way that things are when they are made with care rather than money. He gave her the carved wooden comb he had been working on since November, a thing of smooth pine with her initials worked carefully into one end, and she held it and ran her thumb over the letters, and then she pressed her face against his shoulder for a long moment without speaking. He gave her also, on that same Christmas morning, something he had been thinking about for several weeks. It was a question. He had thought about the best way to ask it, which was a more complicated deliberation than it might appear, because he was a man who had not expected to be asking it and was therefore somewhat without a script for the occasion. He sat across from her at the table with the small pine tree between them and said, Eleanor, I want to marry you. She looked at him over the pine tree. Her brown eyes were very still. I know it has been 2 months, he said, and I know 2 months is not a long time, and I know that the situation brought us together in a way that was not ordinary, and I know you were still carrying the weight of Thomas and the life that did not turn out the way you planned, and I am not asking you to rush anything or feel anything you do not feel, but I want you to know what I want, clearly and directly, which is to marry you and for you to stay here, and for this to be our life. She was quiet for a long time. He let her be. I want that too, she said. I've wanted it for a while. I was waiting to see whether you were going to say it. You could have said it, he pointed out. I know, she said. I was going to if you took much longer. She paused. Yes, Caleb, yes, I will marry you. He did not have a ring because rings were not something a man purchased in advance without specific occasion, but he told her that they would go back to Durango in the spring, and she could have her pick of whatever Hendricks had in stock, and she said she did not care about a ring, which was probably true, though he intended to get her one anyway. They were married in March, when the worst of the winter had broken and the trails were passable again. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Durango every 3 months, a small, precise man named Reverend Holloway, who had seen stranger things in his circuit than a mountain man and his wife, making it official after a winter alone on the ridge, and who performed the words with both reverence and a kind of pragmatic efficiency that suited them both. Mrs. Alderman at the lodging house provided a celebratory supper and declared Eleanor to be the most sensible woman she had met all year, which was meant as a very high compliment and was received as one. They rode back up the mountain on the first truly warm day of spring, Scout walking easy in the melting snow, and Caleb looked at his wife, riding beside him, with her dark hair loose under the wool hat he had bought her in November, wearing the good coat, her face turned up to the early spring sun, and felt something that was so large and complete it had no name he knew for it, only the recognition that this was the thing, the exact and particular thing that he had not known he was missing until he found it. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching him looking. "About how I almost did not ride that direction," he said. "The day I found you, I was heading south. I turned north because I thought I smelled smoke." She looked at him. "What made you think about that?" "I think about it sometimes," he said. "The smallness of it, one direction versus another." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about it too," she said. "I was down to my last piece of jerky. I was very cold. I'd been trying to decide whether to start walking south and how far I could get before I could not get any further." She paused. "And then I heard something moving on the ridge." "Scout," he said. "Scout," she agreed. She looked at the horse with an affection she had extended to the animal over the winter, and which Scout returned in the restrained way of horses. "I thought maybe a deer, but I hoped for something better." He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn. She laced her fingers through his. "Something better," he said. "Something considerably better," she said, and smiled at him, and they rode on up the mountain together. Spring came to the Colorado high country the way it always did, slowly and then all at once, the snow pulling back up the slopes a little each day, the aspens leafing out in the brilliant young green that was one of the things Caleb had never gotten tired of seeing in 15 years. The creek ran high with snowmelt, cold and loud and full of life, and the elk came down into the valley in the mornings, the cows with their new calves moving through the grass, while the bulls stood on the slopes and watched the world. Eleanor came outside every morning for the first weeks of spring and simply stood and looked at it. He would watch her from the cabin door sometimes, her face open and turned toward the mountains, breathing it in. "Every morning," he said once. "You come out every morning and look like you have never seen it." "Every morning it is slightly different," she said. "The snow line changes, the light is different, the elk are in different places. I would not want to miss any of it." He understood this. It was the same quality that made her look at books rather than just through them, the same impulse that had made her climb trees as a child to see as far as possible. She wanted to take in the world fully, to not sleepwalk through it. He had been living in this landscape for 15 years, and she was teaching him to see it again with fresh eyes, and this was one of the ongoing gifts she gave him without even intending it. He added a room to the cabin that spring, working through April and May with a serious focus, because the one main room that had been sufficient for a man alone was not enough for two people who intended to be together for a long time. He felled the timber on the north slope where the pines were thick and straight, hewed the logs, and stacked the new room on the east end of the cabin, with Eleanor working alongside him on the pieces that could be managed by a second pair of hands. She was not strong enough for the heavy lifting, and he did not ask her to be, but she was steady and practical, and she made the whole project faster by her presence. He hired a man from Durango for 2 weeks to help with the roof, a carpenter named James who was Navajo and who had built half the sound structures in the lower valley and who worked with an elegance and economy of motion that Caleb respected. Eleanor fed James at the table with them and talked to him with the same direct, genuine interest she gave to everyone who came to the cabin, and James, who was accustomed to being received as a hired hand and no more in most quarters, responded to this with the particular reserve that means appreciation in a person who is not accustomed to being treated well. James told Eleanor, on his last day at the cabin, that the view from the east room window was the best view in this section of the mountains, which was his particular way of saying he approved of the work. Eleanor thanked him and meant it. She discovered she was carrying their child in June, a discovery she made with the practical certainty of a woman who knows her own body, and then communicated to Caleb on a Tuesday evening while he was sharpening a knife at the table. He looked up from the knife and looked at her. She nodded. He set the knife down and came around the table and held her against his chest, and she put her arms around him, and they stood in the middle of the new room, the evening light coming gold through the east window, and held each other with the quality of holding that acknowledges something enormous. "All right," he said, against her hair. "All right." He pulled back and looked at her face. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. Her eyes were bright. "Are you frightened?" She considered this with honest attention. "A little," she said, "of the practical parts. The birth itself, out here." "We will go to Durango well before the time," he said immediately. "Mrs. Alderman will have you. She has had 6 children of her own, and she will know every midwife in the valley." "She will," Eleanor agreed, and the brightness in her eyes sharpened into something that was pure happiness, uncomplicated and complete. He brought her wildflowers that evening, a great armful of the blue columbines that had just come into bloom on the upper slope, which was not something he had done before, and which he carried down with the same straightforward purposefulness he brought to everything, and presented to her without preamble or poetry, simply held out as a physical expression of what he felt, which was enormous and did not have enough words. She took them and pressed her face into them, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet. "Do not," he said, concerned. "They are good tears," she said. "I'm allowed to have good tears." He was not accustomed to the distinction, but he deferred to her authority on the matter. The summer was the best one he could remember. They were busy in the way that two people building a life together are always busy. The cabin and the new room and the garden Eleanor had put in along the south wall, a small but ambitious plot of vegetables that produced beans and squash and late-season turnips by August. He ran his summer guiding business, taking groups of hunters from the east up into the high country on 3 separate expeditions, bringing Eleanor along on the scouting trips that preceded each one because she had a quick instinct for terrain, and because, he admitted honestly to himself, he did not like being away from her for long. The hunting parties looked at Eleanor with curiosity, a woman who rode alongside the mountain man guide and was clearly not a decoration or an accessory, who could read weather signs and navigate a creek crossing and offered observations about game trails that were always accurate and delivered without self-consciousness. Most of them ended by treating her with the respect that competence commands, though there were a few who required an extra adjustment period. One gentleman from Boston, a man named Alcott who had come west to shoot an elk and had opinions about the proper roles of women that had clearly never been tested against an actual woman with any particular competence, made the mistake of dismissing Eleanor's assessment of a trail. "My wife says it is muddy through the lower meadow and we will do better going around," Caleb said, with the pleasant finality of a man whose statement is not the beginning of a discussion. Alcott rode through the lower meadow anyway, and came back 40 minutes later, having deposited his horse and his dignity in mud up to the knee, and Eleanor received this information with an expression of serene neutrality that Caleb privately found magnificent. Their son was born on a Sunday in February of 1880 at Mrs. Alderman's house in Durango, attended by a midwife named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered 200 babies in the valley, and whose calm competence was the most reassuring thing Caleb had encountered in a considerable number of difficult situations. He had been present in the house, waiting in the parlor with Mrs. Alderman's husband, and a cup of tea that grew cold while he stared at the wallpaper and tried to apply the mountain man's stillness to a situation that did not respond to stillness. When Mrs. Chen came out and told him he had a son and that Eleanor was well, he stood up so fast he knocked the cold tea off the table. The baby was solid and red-faced and had Eleanor's dark hair and what might eventually become Caleb's jaw, and he was, in Caleb's informed and unbiased judgment, remarkable in every respect. Eleanor held him with the focused intensity of a woman who has been through something enormous and come out the other side with the precise and precious thing in her hands. "Henry," she said. "I want to call him Henry." "Henry," he agreed. He was sitting on the edge of the chair beside the bed, one large hand resting gently on the blanket beside his wife and his son, slightly overwhelmed in a way he had no frame of reference for, and which was entirely welcome. "You are crying?" she said, looking at him with an expression of tender amusement. "I am not," he said. "Caleb." "It is the lamp smoke," he said. She laughed, careful and soft, and he leaned down and kissed her forehead, and then, with the enormous gentleness of a very large man handling something very small, he touched his son's face. They took Henry home to the mountain in March, bundled in wool and wrapped against Eleanor's chest on the ride up the trail, and the cabin received them with the solidity of a place that has been waiting and is now complete. Henry Harrow was an easy baby by most measures, curious and watchful, with his mother's habit of looking at things for long periods and his father's tendency toward purposeful quiet. He grew that first year the way mountain children grow, in the particular health of clean air and good food and parents who were fully present, and by his first birthday he had 4 teeth and an opinion about everything and a laugh that came from somewhere in his chest and filled whatever room he was in. The years that followed were full. Caleb's reputation as a guide spread through the hunting circuit, and he began to receive a better class of engagement, wealthy men from the East who paid well and who often returned the following year if the experience was good, which it consistently was. He hired a young man from Durango, a half-Ute boy named Sam, to help with the summer expeditions, and Sam proved to be as good a tracker as Caleb had ever worked with and quick enough with horses to be invaluable on rough terrain. Eleanor expanded the garden each spring. She began trading her surplus vegetables in Durango, and then her preserved goods, and then her talent for sewing was discovered by a woman in town who needed alterations done with speed and precision. And within a year, Eleanor had a small but reliable income from her own work that she managed with the brisk efficiency she brought to all practical matters. They fought sometimes, which was a thing Caleb had not had significant experience with in his adult life, having spent most of it alone, and which he approached at first with the same instinct toward stillness that he applied to other difficult situations. Eleanor did not respond well to stillness in the context of an argument. She needed engagement. She needed the words to be said and heard and responded to, and learning this about her was one of the more significant adjustments of his married life. What he learned was that fighting with her was, in its way, a form of the same honest directness that had drawn him to her in the first place. She said what she meant, and she wanted him to say what he meant. And she was right that things that were said were better than things that sat silent and compounded. And after each hard conversation, which were never truly terrible and were always about real things, they came out on the other side of it, standing on more solid ground than they had been on before. He learned to say harder things. She learned to wait for his silences to finish before pressing for what was in them. It was the ordinary accommodation of two different people making themselves into a unit, and it was worth every bit of the effort it took. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882, and they named her Rose, and she was from her first weeks a different kind of person than Henry, louder and more immediate, with a will that announced itself at top volume and showed no signs of softening with time. Eleanor said Rose was exactly like Eleanor's grandmother, who had reportedly once argued a circuit judge out of a verdict and been asked to leave 3 churches for excess of opinion. Henry adored Rose from the beginning with the steadfast loyalty of an older brother who has decided his sister is his particular responsibility and will fight anyone who says otherwise, which made Rose adore him in return, loudly and without reserve. Caleb looked at his family sometimes in the evenings, the fire lit and Eleanor reading or sewing and Henry working on whatever project currently occupied him, which changed weekly, and Rose nursing or sleeping in the carved wood cradle Caleb had made for her over the winter, and he felt the particular richness of a life that had turned out to contain more than he had planned for. He had not planned for any of it. He had been riding north because he smelled smoke, which was habit and instinct and the mountain man's basic obligation to investigate an anomaly, and it had delivered him to a burned wagon and a young woman curled beneath it who was too cold and too proud and too honest, and who had looked at him on the first day with the level brown gaze that saw exactly what was there and did not pretend otherwise. He told her this one evening, not for the first time, but in more detail than he usually offered to the sentiment. "You know," he said, "that night after I brought you in, after supper when you were asleep, I sat by the fire and I thought about how close it was. If the storm had already been in, I would not have been riding. If I had been 2 days earlier or 2 days later, you would not have been there. If the wind had been from the south instead of the north, I would not have smelled the smoke." Eleanor looked up from her sewing. "I think about it too," she said. "What do you think about it?" She set the sewing down. Henry was asleep. Rose was asleep. The fire was low and comfortable. Through the east window, the stars were out over the mountains, brilliant and steady. "I think that the world is full of near misses that we never know about," she said. "Things that almost happened and did not. And then there are the things that should have happened and did, against every probability." She paused. "And when I think about that burned wagon and how cold I was and how I had been trying to make myself stop being frightened long enough to think clearly, and then I heard Scout on the ridge." She stopped. Her voice had gone soft with the weight of it. "I think the world was not done with me yet, and I think it sent the right person." He looked at her in the firelight, his wife of 3.5 years, the mother of his children, the woman who had reorganized his supply shelf and mended his blanket and talked back to Washington Irving and stood in October snow and said she did not want to go, and he felt it again, that enormous and nameless thing that had no shape he could put around it. He reached out and took her hand. "I was not done with the world either," he said. "I just did not know it until I smelled the smoke." She squeezed his hand and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the fire burned low and the mountains were very quiet outside, and Henry slept and Rose slept and the stars moved slowly over the peaks, and there was nothing unresolved, nothing left open, nothing hanging in the air waiting for an answer. Everything had been said and heard and answered. The burned wagon was still in the valley below the ridge. He had ridden past it twice in the years since, and each time he looked at the blackened frame sitting in the grass, weathered now by 3 years of seasons, and felt the same specific gratitude that was not quite like any other gratitude he knew. It was the gratitude of a man who understands exactly how close he came to never knowing a thing. He'd gone down to it once, the previous summer, when he was passing that way on a guiding trip, and the party had stopped to water the horses at the creek. He had walked over to it alone and stood and looked at it for a moment, at the ground where she had been lying, the particular hollow in the dry grass that was still faintly visible. 3 days she had been there, cold and injured and alone, keeping herself alive on stubbornness and the thin hope that something better might come. She had kept herself alive right up to the moment when better came, and then she had made the pragmatic decision to trust it. That was Eleanor Marsh, who was now Eleanor Harrow. That was the exact nature of her. She kept herself alive, and she did not wait for things to be perfect before she trusted them. She looked at them directly and made her judgment, and her judgment was right. He stood by the old wagon on that summer day and thought, I am glad I rode north. I'm glad I smelled smoke. I'm glad I looked under the wagon. I'm glad she woke up. Then he went back to the horses, and the party moved on up the trail, and the valley was bright behind him in the summer sun. At home that evening, Eleanor had made a pot roast in the Dutch oven, filling the cabin with a smell so good it could be considered a form of persuasion, and Henry was helping set the table with the focused solemnity he brought to all tasks he considered important, and Rose was in the high chair Caleb had built, engaged in the complicated and absorbing project of redistributing her food across as large a surface area as possible. "How was the ride?" Eleanor asked, not looking up from the pot. "Good," he said. He came up behind her at the fireplace and kissed the back of her head. She tilted her head back against him briefly. "Sam says the East Trail is washing out," she said. "I saw. I will fix it next week." "Good." She handed him the pot lid to hold while she stirred. It was the ordinary choreography of a shared kitchen, small and habitual and specific, the way two people who have done something together many times move around each other without needing to think about it. Henry said from the table, "Papa, Sam showed me how to tie a diamond hitch today." "Did he do it right?" Caleb asked. "He did it exactly right," Henry said with 8-year-old precision. "Good man," Caleb said, meaning Sam, though it applied to Henry as well. Rose said something that was not yet a word, but was clearly an urgent editorial about the food situation, and Eleanor turned and attended to this with the speed and ease of a mother for whom such urgencies have been the texture of daily life for 2.5 years. Caleb hung up his coat. He looked at his family in the warm golden light of the cabin, the life that had come from a turned direction and a caught smell, from the cold patience of a woman in a burned wagon and the mountain man's habit of investigating anomalies. He looked at Eleanor's face turned toward Rose, laughing at something the baby had done, and at Henry carefully straightening the spoons, and at the fire and the lamp in the shelf where the green Longfellow stood between Irving and Shakespeare, and the mended blanket on the pallet, and the carved comb he had made her that first Christmas hanging near the mirror. He was, Caleb Harrow decided, a man of considerable luck. Not the blind chance kind, not the stumbled into it kind, but the kind of luck that comes to a man who pays attention and rides toward the smoke, and has the sense to know something valuable when he finds it in the ruins of something burned. He sat down at the table, and Henry climbed into his lap, smelling of horses and pine resin, and the particular outdoor smell of a child who has spent an excellent day outside, and Eleanor set the pot on the table and sat down across from him, and they said grace, and served the food, and the conversation was about the East Trail and Rose's new word, and whether the following spring they should try planting wheat as well as vegetables, and it was entirely ordinary, and it was entirely full. Outside, the night came down over the mountains. The first star appeared above the high peaks, and then another, and then the whole silent blazing sweep of them, the same stars that had been there long before the first wagon rolled west and would be there long after the last one rusted into the ground, unchanged and indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them, the losses and the crossings and the fires and the finding. But inside the cabin on the East Ridge above the Colorado Valley, the lamp was lit, and the fire was warm, and the family at the table was exactly where they belonged, every one of them, and nothing was missing and nothing was unfinished, and nothing was left to chance. The mountain had given Caleb Harrow what the mountain gives all its honest inhabitants in the end, which is not what they planned, and not what they expected, but precisely and completely what they needed, if only they had the courage to ride north when the wind brought the smell of smoke, and to look under the burned-out thing for whatever had survived. She had survived. She had more than survived, and so had he.